Welcome to Should Have Known It, where we present 15-minute videos of things you definitely should have known. Hi, welcome to Shoulda Known It. I'm MS Aoki, and today's topic is the pre-mortem. Klein is a cognitive psychologist who embedded with firefighters, military commanders, and intensive care nurses to study how experts actually make decisions under pressure. What he found over and over was that people are dramatically better at explaining why something failed after it fails than at predicting failure before it happens. This isn't laziness, it's a structural feature of how memory works. When something goes wrong, your brain retrieves a cause. That retrieval feels effortless, obvious even, because the failure itself is a massive cue pointing directly at the cause, but before the failure, no cue. You're floating in possibility space with no anchor. The failure mode that seemed blindingly obvious in hindsight was genuinely hard to see in foresight. Not because you were being careless, but because you were missing the very signal that makes it visible. This asymmetry is the core problem, and the pre-mortem is a deliberate attempt to cheat it, to trigger hindsight cognition before the failure actually happens. You don't wait for the anchor, you manufacture it. Klein published the pre-mortem method in a 1989 paper and popularized it in his 1998 book, Sources of Power. The technique is simple enough to explain in one sentence. Assume your project has already failed, catastrophically, and then work backward to figure out what went wrong. That's it. But the cognitive effect of that assumption is surprisingly powerful. The key word is assume. You don't say imagine it might fail or what are the risks. You say it is 1 year from now, the project is dead. Leadership is upset. The postmortem is scheduled for tomorrow, given that this is true, given that you are in this future and the failure is already real. What happened? That shift from hypothetical to stipulated is everything. What might go wrong activates your planning brain. It produces cautious, hedged, socially acceptable risk lists. What did go wrong activates a completely different mode. The same narrative reconstruction you use when someone asks you why your last relationship ended or why your car broke down. Explanatory cognition is richer, faster, and less inhibited than predictive cognition. You're borrowing the vividness of hindsight before you've paid the price of failure. Now add a group dynamic, and the asymmetry gets worse. In most project kickoffs, someone has already championed the plan. There's momentum, there's enthusiasm, there's a social cost to being the person who says, actually, I think this is going to fail. Even if you believe it, you frame your concern gently. Or you wait to see if anyone else raises it first. Or you decide it probably won't come up and you don't want to be a downer. Psychologists call this mum effect, the documented reluctance to communicate bad news to people who are invested in a different outcome. It's not cowardice, it's social intelligence working exactly as designed, but it systematically suppresses the risk information your team most needs to hear. The pre-mortem reframes the social contract of the meeting. You're not being asked to critique the plan. You're being asked to be good at a game, the game of explaining a failure that has already happened. This reframe licenses honesty in a way that share your concerns never quite does. Suddenly, the contrarian isn't attacking the project, they're playing the exercise correctly. Klein observed this effect in consulting rooms, military planning cells, and NASA project reviews. When people feel licensed to speak, they speak, and what comes out consistently are risks that were known, felt, sensed, half articulated, but never formally surfaced. The pre-mortem doesn't generate new information. It retrieves information that was already there. Here is the exact procedure Klein recommends, which takes 5 to 10 minutes for a standard team meeting. First, the facilitator frames the exercise. Assume it is 12 months from now and this project has failed badly. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to silently write down every reason you can think of for why it failed. Silence is important here. You want individual retrieval before group convergence. After the silent writing phase, you go around the room and each person reads one item from their list, one per turn, round robin, until the lists are exhausted. No discussion during the readout, just surface everything first. This structure prevents the first forceful voice from anchoring the room, which is the dominant failure mode of traditional brainstorming. Every concern gets air before any concern gets evaluated. Then, and only then, you cluster and prioritize. Which failure modes appear on multiple people's lists? Which are catastrophic versus recoverable? Which are actually under your control? That triage is where the real strategic value lives, not in the list itself, but in the patterns across lists, especially the items that appeared independently on several people's lists without coordination. Klein found that the pre-mortem increased the identification of reasons for potential outcomes by roughly 30% in studies he ran with project teams. 30%. That's not marginal improvement, that's a material fraction of your risk landscape that traditional planning simply leaves on the table. Organizations that operate under high consequence, where failures aren't embarrassing but fatal, figured out variants of this independently. NASA's red team reviews function on the same logic. A dedicated group is explicitly tasked with finding reasons the mission fails. The explicit task matters enormously. Without it, the social pull toward cohesion and optimism overwhelms individual doubt. In military planning, the equivalent is called devil's advocate analysis, or, in more formalized intelligence work, Team B analysis, the practice of assigning a separate team to argue the opposite conclusion from your main analytical effort. The 1976 Team B review of CIA Soviet threat assessments is the famous example, though its conclusions turned out to be contested. What's not contested is the structural insight. You need a formal mechanism to surface dissent, or dissent won't surface. Good product teams use the pre-mortem at a specific inflection point, not during ideation and not during execution, but at the moment of commitment, the meeting where you decide, yes, we're doing this. That's when the plan is concrete enough to have real failure modes, but before the sunk cost psychology has taken hold. Once people have spent months building something, their ability to hear failure signals drops precipitously. The pre-mortem is a tool for the last moment before that window closes. There are three categories of risk that pre-mortems are especially good at surfacing, because these are precisely the risks that conventional planning tends to suppress. The first is assumption risk, places where your plan only works if something you haven't examined turns out to be true, a dependency on a third-party vendor delivering on time. An assumption that your users want what you think they want, a technical assumption that hasn't been validated. The second category is people risk, the interpersonal and organizational dynamics that everyone in the room privately knows about, but nobody puts on the risk register. The team lead and the engineering director have been in conflict for 6 months. The one person who understands the legacy system is planning to leave. The stakeholder who approved this project will rotate out before it ships. These aren't speculative risks. They're known quantities that pre-mortem exercises reliably surface because the social frame of explaining a past failure makes it safe to name them. The third is what Klein calls black spots. Risks you didn't anticipate because your team shares too many assumptions. If everyone in the room learned project management from the same tradition, they'll have the same blind spots. Pre-mortems help, but don't fully solve this. You actually need people in the room with different backgrounds. The pre-mortem surfaces what's known but unsaid. It can't manufacture knowledge that nobody on the team has. There's a secondary effect worth naming. Running a pre-mortem on a project that then survives the exercise where you've addressed the failure modes and decided to proceed anyway measurably increases team confidence. Not the inflated, uncalibrated confidence of we haven't thought about what could go wrong, but earned confidence. You've looked at the failure modes, you've addressed the ones you can. You've accepted the ones you can't. That's a different psychological state, and it performs better under pressure. Conversely, if a pre-mortem produces a list of failure modes that nobody can address, that's also valuable information, it's just uncomfortable. Daniel Kahneman, who has written admiringly about Klein's method, makes this point directly. The pre-mortem's most important function might simply be giving people permission to say, we should not do this project right now. Optimism bias is so powerful in planning that even surfacing doubt temporarily is a net win for decision quality. Ask yourself, when was the last time your team formally decided not to proceed because a risk exercise revealed the plan wasn't ready? If the answer is never, that's a signal. Either your organization is phenomenally good at selecting only viable projects, or your risk processes are not actually generating actionable no-go decisions. The pre-mortem creates the conditions for honest no-go decisions. Klein is admirably honest about the method's limits, and you should be too. The pre-mortem performs poorly when the person with the most power in the room is also the strongest advocate for the plan. If the CEO is facilitating their own project's pre-mortem and people know the CEO wants this project approved, the social reframe doesn't fully work. You need the facilitator to be either neutral or explicitly tasked with surfacing failure, not someone whose identity is tied to the plan's success. It also doesn't work as a checkbox. There's a version of the pre-mortem that project managers run because it's on the checklist, where everyone knows the exercise is a formality. The results go into a document nobody rereads, and the team moves on. That version produces no benefit and some cost. It gives people the false reassurance of having done risk analysis without actually doing it. If you're going to run one, the results need to go somewhere real. Mitigation owners. Decision gates, a list of conditions that, if triggered during execution, prompt a genuine recalibration. And there are failure modes the pre-mortem simply cannot catch. The genuinely novel risks that have no analog in anyone's experience. The black swans that wouldn't occur to the room no matter how well you run the exercise. No technique eliminates epistemic limits. What the pre-mortem does is get you much closer to the ceiling of what's knowable to your team. That's valuable. It's not everything. If 10 minutes feels like too much overhead for a small project, there's a compressed version. At the start of any significant meeting where a decision is about to be made, the facilitator says, "Before we finalize this, take 60 seconds, write down the one most likely reason this fails. One reason, 60 seconds, then read them out." This is not a full pre-mortem, but it breaks the silence. It surfaces the top-of-mind concern that everyone is privately holding, and it does it before the decision is locked. Klein calls this the pre-mortem light, and there's evidence that even this abbreviated version reduces the incidence of unexamined assumption risk. The plans that fail not because anyone did anything wrong, but because a key assumption was never interrogated. If you walk out of a meeting having at minimum surfaced your team's individually held top concerns, you're ahead of where most teams are. The pre-mortem is ultimately a practice of intellectual honesty, a structured way of asking your team to say out loud what they privately believe might be true. The surprising thing isn't that it works. The surprising thing is how rarely we create conditions where that kind of honesty is invited. Most planning meetings are, implicitly, advocacy sessions for a plan that's already been decided. The pre-mortem is one of the few tools that temporarily reverses that. And it compounds. Teams that run pre-mortems regularly, not as a box check, but as a genuine practice, get better at it. They develop a vocabulary for naming risks. They learn each other's risk intuitions. The firefighter who's seen 3 structures collapse, and the software engineer who's launched 15 products, and the marketer who's watched 4 campaigns underperform, those people in a room together, running a pre-mortem, are surfacing something real. That room is smarter than any individual in it, but only if the structure lets the knowledge out. Klein spent his career arguing that human expertise is real, that the pattern recognition of experienced practitioners contains genuine predictive signal, and that the job of good decision design is to extract that signal before it gets suppressed by optimism, hierarchy, or the social cost of being the person who said it wouldn't work. The pre-mortem is his answer to that problem. It's 5 minutes, it's free, and it catches the things you already knew but weren't saying. Try it on the next real decision your team makes. Frame it properly, assume failure, not risk. Keep the silence during the individual writing phase. Read everything before you evaluate anything. See what comes out. You might be surprised how much your team already knew. And that brings us to the end. Thank you for joining me and learning something new. Until next time, click like and subscribe.